The train whistle echoed across the Montana plains as Clara Bennett pressed her face against the cold window, watching endless grassland roll past under a gray October sky. In her worn leather satchel lay a single letter that had changed everything, a proposal from a man she'd never met, offering marriage and a new life in the frontier town of Cedar Falls. What she didn't know was that fate had already prepared a test that would demand everything she thought she knew about love, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to be a mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Bennett clutched the letter in her trembling hands as the locomotive thundered westward. Through the autumn landscape of 1889, the ink had faded slightly from repeated readings, but every word remained burned into her memory. Seeking a God-fearing woman of good character for marriage and partnership in ranching enterprise, must be willing to work hard and build a life in frontier territory. Contact Samuel Morrison, Cedar Falls, Montana Territory. At 26, Clara had long accepted that marriage had passed her by. Working as a seamstress in the crowded tenements of Boston, she'd watched younger women find husbands while she remained invisible. Too plain and too poor to attract serious suitors. Her parents had died in the influenza outbreak 3 years prior, leaving her entirely alone in a world that offered few opportunities for unmarried women of modest means. The decision to answer Samuel Morrison's advertisement had been born of desperation rather than romance. The textile factory where she'd worked for 12 years was closing, moving operations to newer facilities in the South where labor came cheaper. Without employment, Clara faced the grim prospect of the poorhouse or worse, a mail-order marriage. To a Montana rancher seemed like salvation, even if it meant leaving behind everything familiar for a life with a complete stranger. Samuel's subsequent letters had been businesslike, but not unkind. He described himself as a 38-year-old widower who owned a substantial cattle ranch outside Cedar Falls. His first wife, Martha, had died in childbirth 4 years earlier. Along with their infant son, he needed a wife to help manage the domestic side of his operation and perhaps, in time, to give him the family he'd lost. The arrangement would be practical rather than romantic, but he promised to treat her with respect and provide her with security. The train car was filled with other travelers heading west, men seeking fortune in mining or ranching, families pursuing homestead dreams, and a few other women who, like Clara, were traveling toward arranged marriages. She'd struck up a conversation with Mary Hutchinson, a cheerful blonde from Philadelphia who was traveling to marry a banker in Billings. "Aren't you nervous?" Mary asked as they shared a simple meal from the lunch baskets they'd packed in Chicago. "I mean, marrying a man we've never seen." Clara considered the question honestly, terrified. She admitted, "But staying in Boston held no future for me. At least this way I have a chance at building something meaningful." "My William sent a photograph," Mary said proudly, producing a daguerreotype of a well-dressed man with kind eyes. "He looks quite handsome, don't you think?" Clara smiled and nodded appropriately, though she privately wondered if the image bore any resemblance to reality. Samuel Morrison had sent no photograph, claiming he wasn't photogenic and preferring that they meet in person. It was one of many small uncertainties that had plagued Clara during the long journey west. The landscape outside their window had transformed dramatically. Over the past 3 days, the crowded cities and industrial towns of the east had given way to farmland, then prairie, and finally the vast open spaces of Montana Territory. Clara had never seen such emptiness, miles upon miles of grassland stretching to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. The sheer scale of the land both thrilled and intimidated her. "Next stop, Cedar Falls," the conductor called out as he passed through their car. Clara's stomach lurched with nervousness. After 4 days of travel, she was about to meet the man who would become her husband. Assuming he found her acceptable when they met face to face, she examined her reflection in the window, noting how the journey had left her dark brown hair somewhat disheveled despite her best efforts. Her gray eyes looked tired, and her plain blue traveling dress, while clean and well-mended, showed the wear of constant use. Clara had never considered herself beautiful. Her face was too angular, her figure too thin, but she hoped Samuel Morrison would find her pleasant enough for their practical arrangement. The train began to slow as buildings appeared in the distance. Cedar Falls proved to be larger than Clara had expected, with a main street lined with businesses, a church steeple rising above the rooftops, and residential areas spreading out from the commercial center. Mountains loomed in the distance. There, peaks already dusted with early snow that promised a harsh winter ahead. As the locomotive hissed to a stop at the modest train station, Clara gathered her few belongings with hands that shook slightly from nervousness. Everything she owned in the world fit into two small cases, and the leather satchel containing her letters, documents, and the small amount of money she'd managed to save. "Good luck," Mary whispered, squeezing Clara's hand. "I hope you find happiness with your rancher." Clara stepped down onto the wooden platform and immediately felt the bite of mountain air, so different from the humid atmosphere of Boston. The altitude made her slightly dizzy, and she paused to catch her breath while scanning the small crowd of people waiting to greet arriving passengers. A tall man in a dark coat and hat approached her with measured steps. "Miss Bennet." Clara turned to face Samuel Morrison for the first time, taking in his appearance with the careful attention of someone whose future depended on this first impression. He was indeed tall, probably 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor. His brown hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and his weathered face suggested years of outdoor work. Most importantly, his blue eyes held kindness rather than coldness, though they also carried a sadness that his letters had only hinted at. "Mr. Morrison," Clara replied, offering a slight curtsy that felt absurdly formal on a train platform in Frontier, Montana. "Thank you for meeting me. Welcome to Cedar Falls," Samuel said, removing his hat politely. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult. Long, but not unpleasant." Clara replied, unsure what else to say to this stranger who intended to become her husband. The reality of her situation suddenly felt overwhelming. She was hundreds of miles from everything familiar, completely dependent on a man she'd known only through letters. Samuel seemed to sense her discomfort. "I've arranged rooms for you at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," he said gently. "I thought you might want a few days to settle in and get acquainted with the town before we proceed with any formal arrangements." The consideration surprised Clara, who had expected to be married immediately upon arrival. "That's very thoughtful of you. My wagon is just over here," Samuel said, taking her heavier case with ease. "Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable establishment, and several of the town's unmarried ladies board there. You'll have company and time to decide if our arrangement suits you." As they walked toward his wagon, Clara studied Cedar Falls with intense curiosity. The main street buzzed with activity despite the late afternoon hour. She noted a general store, a blacksmith shop, a hotel, what appeared to be a doctor's office, and several other businesses that suggested a thriving community. People nodded respectfully to Samuel as they passed, indicating his standing in the local society. "The town's grown considerably in the past few years," Samuel explained as he helped her into the wagon seat. "The railroad brought new opportunities, and we've attracted families seeking good ranch land at reasonable prices." Clara settled beside him, acutely aware of his proximity and the strange intimacy of sharing a wagon seat with a man she'd met only minutes earlier. Samuel handled the horses with practiced ease, his large hands gentle but confident on the reins. "Tell me about your ranch," Clara said, seeking to break the awkward silence that had fallen between them. Samuel's expression brightened slightly. "The Morrison Ranch covers about 2,000 acres in the valley north of town. Good grazing land, reliable water sources, and enough timber for building and fuel. I run about 300 head of cattle, mostly breeding stock. The operation is profitable, though it requires constant attention." "And you manage everything yourself?" "I have 3 full-time hands and hire additional help during busy seasons," Samuel replied. "But yes, much of the responsibility falls to me. That's part of why He paused, seeming to search for appropriate words. "Why I felt the need for a partner." Clara understood what he couldn't quite say, that running a ranch while grieving his lost family had become too much for one person to handle alone. She felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this quiet man who'd lost so much and was trying to rebuild his life through a practical arrangement with a stranger. The boarding house proved to be a comfortable two-story building painted white with green shutters and a welcoming front porch. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman in her 50s with graying hair and warm brown eyes, greeted Clara with genuine enthusiasm. "Miss Bennett, we've been so looking forward to your arrival. Samuel has told us all about you." She bustled around Clara with maternal efficiency, taking her coat and directing Samuel to place her cases in the front hallway. "I've prepared the room at the front of the house. It has the best light and a lovely view of the mountains." "Thank you," Clara said, touched by the warm welcome. "You're very kind." "Nonsense. We ladies must look after each other, especially when someone is brave enough to travel so far from home." Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled with curiosity and approval. "Samuel, you'll stay for supper, won't you? I'm sure Miss Bennett would appreciate a familiar face while she adjusts to our little community." Samuel looked to Clara questioningly. "If Miss Bennett doesn't object to my company, I would welcome it," Clara replied honestly. The prospect of eating alone among strangers on her first night felt daunting. Over supper in Mrs. Patterson's cozy dining room, Clara met the other boarders-to-school teachers, a bank clerk, and the wife of a traveling salesman who was temporarily staying in town. The conversation was lively and welcoming, with everyone eager to share information about Cedar Falls and its residents. "Samuel's ranch is one of the most successful in the county," commented Miss Sarah Williams, one of the teachers. "He's known for his fair dealing and his quality livestock. And he's been far too alone since Martha's passing," added Mrs. Patterson, with the frankness of someone who'd known Samuel for years. "A man needs a family, especially in this country where life can be harsh." Clara noticed Samuel's discomfort at being discussed so openly, but she also detected appreciation for his friend's obvious concern for his welfare. It spoke well of his character that people cared enough about him to want to see him happy. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself relaxing in Samuel's presence. He was quiet, but not unfriendly, thoughtful in his responses to questions, and respectful in his attention to her comfort. When she mentioned her experience with sewing and household management, his interest seemed genuine rather than merely polite. The ranch house could benefit from a woman's touch, Samuel admitted as they sat on Mrs. Patterson's front porch after supper, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "I'm afraid I've focused entirely on the practical aspects of keeping the operation running." "What was it like when your wife was alive?" Clara asked gently, then immediately worried she'd been too forward. Samuel was quiet for several minutes, and Clara feared she'd caused him pain. Finally, he spoke softly. "Martha made everything better just by being there. She had a gift for creating warmth and comfort, for making a house feel like a home. I realize now how much I took that for granted. I'm sure she was wonderful," Clara said sincerely. "She was," Samuel agreed. "But she's gone, and I've learned that grief, while natural, can become a luxury a man can't afford indefinitely. Life requires moving forward, even when the heart isn't ready." Clara heard the wisdom and pain in his words, recognizing a man who'd wrestled with loss and emerged with hard-won understanding. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "our arrangement could benefit us both. I need security and purpose, and you need someone to help carry the load of building a life." Samuel turned to look at her directly for the first time that evening. "I want you to know, Miss Bennett, that I have no expectations beyond what we discussed in our letters. This would be a marriage of convenience and mutual support. I won't demand more than you're willing to give." The assurance touched Clara deeply, though she also felt a strange disappointment. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Morrison. I believe we could build something good together, even if it's not the romance young girls dream about." "Then you're willing to proceed with our arrangement?" Clara looked out at the vast Montana landscape, so different from everything she'd known, and felt a sense of rightness she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said firmly, "I think I am." What neither Clara nor Samuel knew was that their practical arrangement was about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. Hidden in the mountains above Cedar Falls, 5 orphaned children were struggling to survive the approaching winter. their desperate prayers about to be answered in ways that would transform everyone's understanding of what family truly meant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days after Clara's arrival in Cedar Falls, she stood before Reverend Thomas Mackenzie in the modest wooden church that served the growing community. The simple ceremony was attended by Mrs. Patterson, the other boarding house residents, and several townspeople who'd become curious about Samuel Morrison's mail-order bride. Clara wore her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out her eyes, while Samuel looked uncomfortable but dignified in his Sunday suit. "Do you, Samuel Morrison, take Clara Bennett to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the gravity of marrying a woman he'd known for only 3 days. "And do you, Clara Bennett, take Samuel Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Clara looked into Samuel's kind blue eyes and felt a calm certainty she hadn't expected. "I do." The Reverend smiled warmly as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride, Samuel." Samuel leaned forward and placed a gentle, respectful kiss on Clara's lips, their first physical contact beyond handshakes. It was brief and proper, but Clara felt a flutter of something that might, in time, grow into deeper feeling. The small reception at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was cheerful and welcoming. The townspeople seemed genuinely pleased to see Samuel remarried, and several women approached Clara with offers of friendship and assistance as she adjusted to ranch life. "You'll need to learn about preserving meat for winter," advised Mrs. Helen Carter, the doctor's wife, "and Samuel's garden has been sadly neglected since Martha's passing. I'd be happy to share some seeds and advice come spring. The altitude can be challenging at first," added Miss Williams, the school teacher. "Make sure you rest when you feel dizzy and drink plenty of water. Your body will adjust within a few weeks." As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself observing Samuel carefully, trying to understand the man she'd just married. He was polite with their guests, but clearly more comfortable discussing cattle prices and weather patterns than social pleasantries. She noticed how he unconsciously touched his wedding ring, Martha's ring, which he'd moved to his right hand that morning, and realized this day must be both hopeful and painful for him. When the last guest departed, Samuel helped Clara load her few possessions into his wagon for the journey to what was now her home. The Morrison Ranch lay 15 miles north of Cedar Falls, accessible by a well-maintained road that wound through rolling grassland and stands of pine trees. "The house isn't fancy," Samuel said as they rode through the gathering dusk, "but it's solid and comfortable. Martha and I built it to last. I'm sure it will be perfect," Clara replied, though nervousness fluttered in her stomach. She was about to enter the home Samuel had shared with his first wife, to sleep in rooms where Martha had lived and died. The prospect felt both intimate and intrusive. The Morrison Ranch revealed itself gradually as they crested a low hill. The main house was a 2-story log structure with a wide front porch and stone chimney, surrounded by several outbuildings including a large barn, a chicken coop, and what appeared to be bunkhouses for the ranch hands. Lamplight glowed warmly in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney into the clear mountain air. "It's beautiful," Clara said sincerely. The house looked solid and welcoming, nestled in a natural clearing with the dark pine forest rising behind it. "Miguel Rodriguez, my foreman, has been keeping the fires going and taking care of basic maintenance," Samuel explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "He and his wife Elena live in the larger cabin with their children. You'll meet them tomorrow." Inside, the house was indeed comfortable, furnished with sturdy handmade pieces and decorated with quilts and curtains that spoke of a woman's touch. Clara tried not to think about Martha as she examined her new home, but traces of the previous Mrs. Morrison were everywhere in the carefully arranged kitchen. The books on the shelves, the dried flowers still hanging in the pantry. "I can change things," Samuel said quietly, noticing her careful inspection. "I know it might be difficult, living with another woman's arrangements." Clara turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "It's a lovely home, Samuel. Martha had excellent taste. I wouldn't want to erase her memory. This was her home too. Perhaps, in time, I can add my own touches while honoring what she built." Relief flickered across Samuel's face. "I hoped you might feel that way." I wasn't sure how to handle the situation. Their first evening as a married couple was quiet and somewhat awkward. Samuel showed Clara through the house, explaining practical matters like the pump in the kitchen, the wood stove's quirks, and the locations of supplies. They ate a simple supper of bread, cheese, and preserves that Elena Rodriguez had left for them, making polite conversation about the ranch's routines and Clara's observations about Montana. When bedtime arrived, Samuel cleared his throat nervously. "I've prepared the guest room for myself," he said. "I thought you should have the main bedroom until our arrangement becomes more comfortable for both of us." Clara felt both relief and a strange disappointment. "That's very considerate of you." "I rise early to tend to the animals," Samuel continued. "Feel free to sleep as late as you need while you adjust to ranch life. Elena will be by in the morning to help with breakfast and show you around." Alone in what had been Martha's bedroom, Clara unpacked her few belongings and prepared for her first night as Mrs. Morrison. The room was comfortable, with a large bed covered in a beautiful wedding ring quilt and windows that looked out over the ranch yard. As she brushed her hair before the mirror, Clara found herself wondering what kind of woman Martha had been, and whether she could ever fill the void her predecessor had left. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds. Wind in the pines, cattle lowing in the distance, and the settling noises of a house she didn't yet know. Clara woke several times, momentarily confused about where she was before remembering her new circumstances. Dawn came early, announced by Samuel's quiet movements as he prepared for the day's work. Clara dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found coffee already brewing and Samuel pulling on his work boots. "Good morning," he said, looking slightly surprised to see her awake. "I didn't expect you to rise so early. I'm accustomed to early hours," Clara replied, pouring herself coffee from the pot. "What can I do to help?" Before Samuel could answer, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Elena Rodriguez, a cheerful woman in her 30s with dark hair and bright brown eyes. She was accompanied by her oldest daughter, Carmen, a girl of about 10. "Segura Morrison," Elena exclaimed, embracing Clara warmly. "Welcome to the ranch. We are so happy Samuel has found happiness." "Again, thank you," Clara said, touched by the genuine warmth of the greeting. "Please, call me Clara. Today I show you everything," Elena announced. "The chickens, the garden, the pantry, all the things that make a ranch work. Carmen will help, yes?" Carmen nodded shyly, clearly curious about the new Mrs. Morrison, but too polite to stare openly. Samuel departed for his morning rounds, leaving Clara in Elena's capable hands. The next several hours provided a comprehensive education in ranch life. Elena showed her how to collect eggs, tend the vegetable garden, and manage the complicated logistics of feeding ranch hands who worked long days in all weather. "Cedar Samuel. He is a good man," Elena confided as they hung laundry on the line behind the house. "But since Segura Martha died, he worked too much," smiled a little. "Maybe now he remember how to be happy again." "I hope so," Clara said honestly. "We're both trying to build something good from a difficult situation." Elena nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the heart needs time to catch up with the mind, no? But I think you are what this place needs." As they worked, Clara found herself genuinely enjoying Elena's company and the physical tasks of ranch life. After years of sitting hunched over sewing in poorly lit rooms, the fresh air and outdoor work felt invigorating. The morning's peace was shattered when young Jamie Thompson, the 12-year-old son of a neighboring rancher, came galloping into the yard on a lathered horse. His face was flushed with excitement and fear. "Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Rodriguez," he called out breathlessly. "I need to find Mr. Morrison right away. There's something up in Eagle Canyon, something he needs to see." "What is it, Jamie?" Elena asked, immediately concerned. "Kids," Jamie said, sliding down from his horse. "Orphan kids, looks like. Found them this morning when I was tracking strays. They're living in an old mining cabin, and they look half-starved. Clara felt her heart clench with sympathy and alarm. "How many children?" "5 of them." Jamie replied. "The oldest looks maybe 12 or 13, and there's a baby too. They ran when they saw me, but I could tell they're in bad shape." Elena crossed herself and began muttering prayers in Spanish. "Dios mío." "Children alone in the mountains with winter coming. Where exactly did you see them?" Clara asked, her mind already racing with implications. "Eagle Canyon, about 8 miles northeast of here. There's an old mining claim up there with some cabins the prospectors abandoned when the vein played out." Clara looked toward the pastures where Samuel was working with his cattle. Too far away to hear Jamie's news. "Elena, can you send Carmen to fetch Samuel? We need to investigate this immediately." "See, of course." Elena called to her daughter, who ran toward the pastures with the urgent message. While they waited for Samuel's return, Clara questioned Jamie more thoroughly about what he'd observed. The boy described children dressed in ragged clothes, clearly frightened and defensive. The oldest appeared to be a girl who seemed to be caring for the younger ones, including what looked like a toddler barely old enough to walk. They had a little fire going outside the cabin, Jamie continued, but no proper camp setup. "Look like they've been living rough for some time." Samuel arrived within minutes, his face grim as he absorbed Jamie's report. "Eagle Canyon's remote enough that they could have been there for weeks without anyone knowing." He said, "If they're truly orphaned and alone, they won't survive the winter. What should we do?" Clara asked, though her heart already knew the answer. Samuel looked at his new wife, perhaps testing her character in this first crisis of their marriage. "We go to them," he said simply. "No child should face the wilderness alone. I'll come with you." Clara said immediately, "It might be dangerous." Samuel warned, "Desperate people, even children, can be unpredictable. Then they'll need someone who seems less threatening than a strange man." Clara replied firmly. "Children respond better to women, especially if they've been hurt or abandoned." Samuel studied her face and apparently found what he was looking for. "All right, Elena, can you pack some food and blankets? We'll take the supply wagon in case we need to transport children." As they prepared for the journey to Eagle Canyon, Clara felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with her concern. She'd been in Montana for less than a week, married for less than a day, and already faced with a situation that would test both her character and her new marriage. But something deep inside told her this moment was important, that these unknown children needed her as much as she might need them. The wagon ride through the Montana wilderness toward Eagle Canyon took nearly 2 hours over rough terrain. Samuel drove carefully, navigating rocky trails and steep grades while Clara held tight to the supplies they'd packed. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder, reminding them both that winter was approaching. Rapidly, "There," Samuel said finally, pointing toward a cluster of ramshackle buildings nestled against a cliff face. "The old Morrison claim no relation to my family, just coincidence of names." Clara studied the abandoned mining operation with growing concern. The cabins looked barely weatherproof, and the isolation was complete. If children were indeed living here, they were surviving in conditions that would challenge experienced frontiersmen. As their wagon approached the main cabin, a small figure darted between the buildings, a flash of movement that confirmed Jamie's report. They were not alone in this desolate place. Samuel brought the wagon to a stop, a respectful distance from the buildings, and called out in a gentle voice, "Hello. We're not here to hurt anyone. We just want to help." Silence answered them, but Clara sensed they were being watched from the shadows of the ruined buildings. Somewhere in those dark cabins, 5 children were deciding whether to trust these strangers or flee deeper into the wilderness. The next few minutes would determine not only the fate of those unknown children, but the entire future of Clara and Samuel's marriage. The silence stretched between the abandoned mining cabins and Samuel's wagon, broken only by the wind whistling through the pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk. Circling overhead, Clara sat perfectly still, her eyes scanning the shadowed doorways and broken windows of the ramshackle buildings, knowing that frightened children were watching their every move. "I'm going to step down from the wagon," Clara said quietly to Samuel, "slowly, so they can see I'm not armed or threatening." Samuel nodded, his own eyes alert for any sign of movement. I'll stay with the wagon unless you need me. Children who've been living rough might be more afraid of men." Clara climbed down carefully, her long skirts making the process awkward, but giving her movements a clearly feminine appearance. She walked a few steps toward the largest cabin, then stopped and called out in a gentle voice that carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "My name is Clara Morrison. I live on a ranch not far from here with my husband Samuel. We heard there might be children here who need help." A slight rustling sound came from inside the main cabin, but no one appeared. "We brought food," Clara continued, settling herself on a large rock to appear less threatening. "Fresh bread, milk, and warm blankets. Winter's coming soon, and these mountains get very cold." This time the response was more distinct, a child's voice whispering urgently to others, though the words were too quiet to understand that Samuel remained by the wagon, but called out in his own gentle tone, "We're not here to take anyone away who doesn't want to go. We just want to make sure everyone's safe and has enough to eat." Several minutes passed before a small face appeared at the edge of the cabin's doorway. A girl of perhaps 7 or 8 with tangled blonde hair and enormous blue eyes that held far too much wariness for someone so young. She studied Clara intently, clearly trying to determine if these strangers represented safety or danger. "Hello," Clara said softly, not moving from her rock. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The little girl didn't answer, but stepped slightly further into view, revealing a thin frame dressed in clothes that had once been a pretty dress, but were now patched and dirty from months of wear. "My name is Lucy," the child finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's a beautiful name," Clara replied warmly. "Lucy, are there other children here with you?" Lucy glanced back into the cabin, clearly seeking permission or instruction from someone else. After a moment, she nodded. "Are they your brothers and sisters?" Another nod, followed by Lucy pointing toward the cabin. "Annie says I shouldn't talk." "Two strangers, but you brought food?" Clara's heart ached at the hope and hunger she heard in that simple question. "Yes, we did. Fresh bread that's still warm, and milk, and some apples. Would you like some?" Before Lucy could answer, another figure emerged from the cabin, an older girl of perhaps 13, with dark brown hair pulled back severely and green eyes that held a protective fierceness that reminded Clara painfully of herself at that age. This had to be Annie, clearly the leader and guardian of whatever family group was hiding in these mountains. "Lucy, get back inside," Annie commanded in a voice that carried surprising authority. "But Annie, they have food, and the lady seems nice. Now, Lucy." The little girl reluctantly retreated, but Clara could see her peeking around the doorframe with obvious longing. Annie stepped fully into view, and Clara was struck by how thin the girl was beneath her brave facade. Her dress was even more patched than Lucy's, and Clara could see the careful way she moved, as if conserving energy was crucial for survival. "What do you want?" Annie demanded, though Clara could hear the exhaustion beneath her defiant tone. "Just to help," Clara replied honestly. "We live on a ranch where there's plenty of food and warm shelter. Winter's coming, and these cabins won't protect you from mountain snow and cold. We're doing fine on our own," Annie said, but her voice lacked conviction. From inside the cabin came the unmistakable sound of a baby crying, a thin, weak wail that spoke of hunger and distress. Annie's protective mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the desperate fear of a child trying to care for others with no resources. "That sounds like a very young baby," Clara observed gently. "Babies need milk and warmth to survive mountain winters." "We manage," Annie insisted, but she was fighting back tears. Samuel spoke from his position by the wagon, his voice carefully non-threatening. "Annie, I'm Samuel Morrison. My wife Clara and we understand about taking care of family when there's no one else to help. We're not here to separate anyone or take anyone where they don't want to go. We just want to make sure everyone survives the winter." "You don't understand," Annie said, her composure finally cracking. "If the authorities find us, they'll split us up. They'll send the little ones to orphanages hundreds of miles apart, and I'll never see them again. We promised our mama before she died that we'd stay together no matter what." Clara felt tears spring to her own eyes at the pain and determination in Annie's voice. This brave girl was trying to honor a dying mother's wishes, while facing impossible circumstances. How long has your mother been gone? Clara asked softly. 3 months, Annie whispered. Papa died in a mining accident 2 years ago, and Mama got sick after baby Thomas was born. She made me promise to keep us all together. And you've been living here all this time? Annie nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. We had some food saved up, and there's a spring nearby. I've been trying to trap rabbits and find berries, but winter's coming and the baby. Her voice broke entirely. Clara stood slowly, making no sudden movements that might startle the frightened girl. Annie, what if there was a way to keep your family together and still have food and warmth for the winter? What if you didn't have to choose between safety and staying together? That's impossible, Annie said bitterly. Adults always say they'll help, but they always want to split up families. That's what they do to poor children. Not all adults, Samuel said firmly. Annie, my wife and I, we have a large ranch with plenty of room. If you and your brothers and sisters wanted to come stay with us, you could all stay together. You'd have your own space, good food, and warmth through the winter. And then what? Annie demanded. Come spring, you turn us over to the territorial authorities anyway. Clara stepped closer, close enough that Annie could see the sincerity in her eyes. Annie, I was poor once too. I know what it's like to have no one to depend on but yourself. I would never promise something I couldn't deliver. If you came to our ranch, it would be because we want you there, all of you, for as long as you need a home. The sound of the crying baby grew more distressed, and Annie's resolve visibly wavered. From inside the cabin came other voices, children comforting the infant and whispering among themselves. How do I know you're telling the truth? Annie asked. Desperately, you don't, Clara admitted. But you do know that staying here much longer isn't going to work. That baby needs milk and warmth, and you need help carrying the load of taking care of everyone. Annie stared at Clara for a long moment, clearly wrestling with an impossible decision. Trust strangers with her family's lives, or continue trying to survive in conditions that were already failing. Them, can I see the others? Clara asked gently. I'd like to meet the children you've been taking such good care of. After another long hesitation, Annie nodded and called back into the cabin. It's okay. You can come out. What emerged from that ramshackle cabin broke Clara's heart completely. Lucy appeared first, followed by a boy of about 10 with sandy brown hair and Annie's green eyes. Behind him came twin boys who looked to be about 5 years old, identical except that one was obviously ill, pale, and listless in a way that spoke of serious malnutrition. Finally, Annie emerged carrying a baby who couldn't have been more than 8 months old. Little Thomas was painfully thin, his clothes hanging loose on his tiny frame, and his cries were weak with exhaustion. This is my family, Annie said with fierce pride despite their obvious distress. Lucy, Michael, the twins are Johnny and Jacob and baby Thomas. Clara felt Samuel step up beside her, and she heard his sharp intake of breath at the sight of the children's condition. Jacob, one of the twins, was clearly seriously ill, swaying on his feet as he tried to stand with his brothers. Jacob's been sick for a week, Annie said, noticing their concern. I don't know what's wrong, but he won't eat, and he has a fever. Clara knelt down to Jacob's level, noting his flushed cheeks and glassy eyes. Even without medical training, she could see the child needed immediate care. Annie, she said urgently, Jacob needs to see a doctor right away, and Thomas needs milk and proper food. Please, let us help you. Annie looked at her sick brother, then at the hungry baby in her arms, and finally at the other children, who were staring longingly at the wagon full of supplies. Clara could see the exact moment when maternal instinct overcame fear. If we come with you, Annie said slowly, and we don't like it, or if you try to separate us, we leave. All of us together. Agreed, Samuel said immediately. You have my word and mine, Clara added. Annie, you've done an incredible job taking care of your family, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. The next hour was spent carefully loading the children and their few possessions into the wagon. Clara was shocked by how little they owned. A few changes of clothes, a tattered Bible, and a small wooden horse that had obviously been carved by loving hands. Probably their father's work. Jacob was too weak to sit up on his own, so Clara held him in her lap, Alarmed by the heat radiating from his small body, Thomas fussed constantly, clearly hungry and uncomfortable, while the other children sat quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden change in their circumstances. "We need to get Jacob to Dr. Carter immediately," Samuel said as he guided the wagon carefully down the mountain trail. "And Thomas needs milk and proper food." "Elena will help," Clara said. "Already planning. She's raised for children of her own, and she'll know exactly what Thomas needs." As they descended toward the ranch, Clara found herself marveling at the courage of the girl sitting beside her. Annie had kept her family alive for 3 months in conditions that would have challenged experienced adults. She'd honored her mother's dying wish to keep them together, even when it meant choosing between safety and unity. "Annie," Clara said softly, "your mother would be very proud of how you've taken care of everyone." "I tried my best," Annie replied, tears finally flowing freely. "But I was so scared they were going to die, and it would be my fault." "You saved them," Clara said firmly. "By making the hard choice to trust us, you saved your whole family." The ranch came into view as the sun was setting, its windows glowing warmly with lamplight. Clara felt a sense of homecoming that surprised her. She'd lived there for less than a day, but already it felt like sanctuary. Elena Rodriguez was waiting in the yard, having spotted their approach from a distance. Her eyes widened as she saw the children in the wagon, but her face immediately softened with maternal concern. "Dios mío," she breathed, reaching up to help lift little Thomas from Annie's arms. "Poor babies. Elena will take care of you now." As they carried the children into the warm ranch house, Clara realized that her quiet mail-order marriage had just become something much more complicated and much more meaningful. She was no longer just Samuel's practical wife. She was about to become a mother to 5 children who desperately needed someone to believe in them and fight for their right to stay together. The real test of their marriage was just beginning. The ranch house erupted into organized chaos as Elena Rodriguez took charge, with the efficiency of an experienced mother. While Samuel rode hard for town to fetch Dr. Carter, Elena transformed the main room into a makeshift medical ward, directing Clara and the older children with gentle but firm commands. "Lucy, you help me heat water on the stove," Elena instructed, her arms full of clean towels and blankets. "Michael, bring more wood for the fire. We need this room very warm for the little ones." Clara found herself holding baby Thomas while Elena prepared a makeshift formula from cow's milk, honey, and warm water. The infant was so weak he could barely cry, his tiny fists waving feebly as Clara tried to coax him to take nourishment from a cloth soaked in the mixture. "Come on, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her heart breaking at the baby's condition. "Just a little bit. You need to get stronger." Annie hovered nearby, her green eyes filled with terror as she watched her youngest brother struggle. "He's dying, isn't he?" she whispered. "I've killed him by waiting too long to get help." "No," Clara said firmly, meeting Annie's gaze. "You kept him alive for 3 months against impossible odds. That's not failure, Annie, that's a miracle." Elena approached with a warm, damp cloth and began gently cleaning Thomas's face and hands. "Babies, they are tougher than we think," she said soothingly. "My youngest, he was this thin when I first came to America. Look at him now, biggest boy in his class." Jacob, the sick twin, lay on the sofa wrapped in quilts, his fever making him delirious. He called repeatedly for his mama, breaking everyone's hearts with his weak, confused voice. Johnny, his healthy twin, refused to leave his brother's side, holding Jacob's hand and whispering reassurances that everything would be fine. "Jacob and me, we're never apart," Johnny explained to Clara when she tried to coax him to eat something. "Mama said we came into the world together and we're supposed to stay together." The devotion between the twins reminded Clara powerfully of her own childhood loneliness. She'd never had siblings to love and protect, never experienced the fierce loyalty these children showed for each other. Despite their desperate circumstances, Dr. William Carter arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand and his weathered face grave with concern. He was a man in his 60s who'd seen frontier medicine at its most challenging, but even he seemed shocked by the children's condition. "How long have they been living rough?" he asked quietly as he examined Jacob first, noting the child's dangerously high fever and signs of severe malnutrition. 3 months, Annie replied, standing protectively near the sofa. Since Mama died. I did everything I could, but the food ran out and winter's coming. Dr. Carter's expression softened as he looked at the 13-year-old girl who'd tried so hard to save her family. You did remarkably well, young lady. Many adults wouldn't have managed half as much. His examination of Jacob revealed pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition, a dangerous combination that required immediate and aggressive treatment. We need to get fluids into him and break this fever, Dr. Carter explained to Clara and Elena. The next 24 hours will be critical. Thomas proved equally challenging. The baby was severely undernourished and dehydrated, unable to take enough formula to sustain his tiny body. Dr. Carter worked with Elena to create a feeding schedule that would gradually rebuild the infant's strength without overwhelming his weakened digestive system. He'll need feeding every 2 hours around the clock, the doctor instructed, and someone needs to monitor his breathing constantly. Babies this week can fail very quickly. Clara immediately volunteered for the night watches, though Annie protested that it was her responsibility as Thomas's sister. Annie, Clara said gently, you've been carrying this load alone for months. Let me help you now. The other children, while not as critically ill, all showed signs of prolonged malnutrition and stress. Lucy had developed a persistent cough that worried Dr. Carter, and Michael moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had learned to conserve energy. Even their emotional responses seemed muted, as if months of survival had taught them to suppress normal childhood reactions. Samuel returned from town with additional medical supplies and troubling news. Sheriff Henderson was in the general store, he reported quietly to Clara while the children were occupied with Elena's cooking. Word's already spreading about the children. There are people asking questions about their legal status. Clara felt a chill of fear. What kind of questions? The territorial authorities are supposed to be notified when orphaned children are found, Samuel explained grimly. There are procedures, legal requirements. If we don't report them, then we report them, Clara said firmly. But we make sure Annie's promise to her mother is honored. These children stay together, no matter what. Samuel studied his new wife's determined expression. Clara, you understand what you're saying. Taking on 5 children, including a sick baby and a girl who's barely past childhood herself. Our marriage is 1 day old, and you're talking about becoming a mother to children who aren't even legally ours. Clara looked across the room where Annie was helping Elena feed Thomas, while Lucy read to the twins from a children's book Samuel had found on the shelf. The sight of this makeshift family, already beginning to trust and rely on each other, filled her with a certainty she'd never felt about anything in her life. Samuel, she said quietly, I came to Montana expecting to be a practical wife who helped with household duties. But sometimes life gives us opportunities to become more than we ever imagined. These children need us, and I need them more than I realized. Samuel followed her gaze, watching his home transform from a quiet bachelor residence into something alive with purpose and love. When he spoke again, his voice held wonder. Martha always wanted a house full of children. She said a home wasn't really complete until it echoed with young voices, and now it does. Clara observed softly. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the main room. Jacob's fever had spiked again, causing convulsions that terrified his siblings. Dr. Carter worked quickly to cool the child's body while Elena held Johnny back from his frantic attempts to help his twin. Is he going to die? Lucy asked in a small voice, tears streaming down her face. Annie gathered her little sister close, her own fear barely controlled. Dr. Carter's taking good care of him. Jacob's strong, he'll fight through this. But Clara could see the doubt in Annie's eyes, the terrible weight of responsibility she'd carried for so long. This brave girl had watched her parents die and had spent months trying to prevent the same fate from claiming her siblings. The fear of failure was crushing her spirit even as she tried to maintain hope for the others. Clara sat down beside Annie and spoke quietly. When I was about your age, I watched my grandmother die from pneumonia. I blamed myself for not being able to save her, for not knowing what to do. It took me years to understand that sometimes being there, being present and loving, is the most important thing we can do. But what if it's not enough? Annie whispered. What if I lose him after everything we've been through? Then you'll know you did everything possible, Clara replied gently. And you won't face it alone. You have a family now that's bigger than just your brothers and sisters. As the night wore on, the ranch house took on the rhythm of a medical ward. Clara and Elena took turns feeding Thomas every 2 hours, while Dr. Carter monitored Jacob's condition. Samuel stayed close, helping with practical matters and offering quiet support when the stress became overwhelming. The other children gradually settled into sleep despite their worry, exhausted by months of survival and the emotional trauma of their circumstances. Michael curled up in a chair near Jacob's sofa, unwilling to be far from his sick brother. Lucy fell asleep in Clara's lap during one of Thomas's feeding sessions, her small body finally relaxing in the security of adult protection. Around midnight, Jacob's fever finally broke. His breathing eased, and the dangerous flush left his cheeks as his body began responding to Dr. Carter's treatment. Johnny, who'd maintained his vigil despite exhaustion, finally allowed himself to sleep beside his twin. He's going to recover, Dr. Carter told Annie, with obvious relief. It'll take time to rebuild his strength, but the crisis has passed. Annie's composure finally cracked completely. Months of terror, responsibility, and desperate hope poured out in tears that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Clara held the sobbing girl, marveling at the courage this child had shown in circumstances that would have broken most adults. I was so scared, Annie wept. Every night I was terrified I'd wake up and find one of them had died because I didn't know how to help them. But you did know, Clara insisted. You brought them to shelter, found food, kept them warm, and most importantly, you kept them together. You honored your mother's trust. Elena approached with fresh coffee and her own maternal wisdom. Mija, she said gently to Annie, you are a very brave girl, but you are still a girl. It's time now to let the adults carry some of the worry. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, the ranch house had transformed into something none of them could have imagined 24 hours earlier. Samuel's practical bachelor home had become a refuge for 5 orphaned children, and Clara's role as a mail-order bride had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. Thomas had managed to take nearly a full ounce of formula during his last feeding, and his color was improving. Jacob slept peacefully, his breathing steady and his fever gone. The other children showed signs of relaxing for the first time in months, their natural personalities beginning to emerge from beneath the survival instincts that had sustained them. But Clara knew their challenges were just beginning. Legal questions about the children's custody would need to be addressed. Annie's fierce independence would need to be balanced with accepting help from adults. The practical matters of feeding, clothing, and educating 5 additional family members would strain even Samuel's prosperous ranch. Most challenging of all, Clara would need to prove to herself and everyone else that a woman who'd never been a mother could suddenly become the guardian angel these children desperately needed. As she sat in the rocking chair holding Thomas while Lucy slept curled against her side, Clara felt a sense of purpose she'd never experienced. She'd come to Montana seeking security and a practical marriage. Instead, she'd found a calling that would test every resource of courage, patience, and love she possessed. The sun was rising on a new day and a new life for all of them. The real work of becoming a family was about to begin. 3 days after the children's rescue, Sheriff William Henderson arrived at the Morrison Ranch with a grim expression and a leather satchel full of official documents. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he dismounted his horse and spoke quietly with Samuel near the barn, their conversation clearly serious and troubling. Inside the house, the children had begun to show remarkable improvement. Jacob was sitting up and taking solid food, his color returning as Dr. Carter's treatment worked its magic. Baby Thomas had gained nearly a pound and was beginning to smile, a sight that melted Clara's heart completely. Lucy had appointed herself as Thomas's special protector, singing to him and helping with his feedings with the natural maternal instinct of a little girl who'd grown up to fast. Mrs. Morrison, Sheriff Henderson said formally as he entered the kitchen, removing his hat respectfully. I need to speak with you and your husband about the children's legal situation. Annie immediately appeared in the doorway, her protective instincts on high alert. "What kind of legal situation?" she demanded, moving to stand between the sheriff and her younger siblings. "Annie," Clara said gently, "why don't you take Lucy and the boys into the main room? Sheriff Henderson needs to discuss some official matters with us first." "No," Annie said firmly. "Whatever you're going to say affects my family. I have a right to hear it." Sheriff Henderson studied the 13-year-old girl with obvious respect. "You're quite right, Miss Annie. This does concern your family." He opened his satchel and withdrew several official-looking papers. "I've received word from the Territorial Children's Services Office in Helena. They're sending an agent to investigate the children's circumstances and determine proper placement." Clara felt her blood turn cold. "What kind of placement?" "Standard procedure for orphaned children," the sheriff explained reluctantly. "They'll be evaluated for placement in appropriate institutions or foster families throughout the territory." "Separate families?" Annie asked, her voice rising with panic. Sheriff Henderson's expression grew more uncomfortable. "The reality is that most families can't accommodate 5 children, especially when one is an infant requiring special care. The agent will likely recommend splitting them among several placements." "No." The word came out as a whisper from Annie, but it carried the force of absolute determination. "We promised Mama we stay together." Samuel stepped forward, his jaw set with quiet determination. "Sheriff, what if the children already have a placement? What if they're wanted here, all of them? As a family, that would certainly be preferable." Sheriff Henderson replied carefully, "But there are legal requirements. The territorial agent will need to investigate the suitability of any proposed guardians. Income, living conditions, moral character, everything will be scrutinized." Clara exchanged glances with Samuel, understanding the implications immediately. They'd been married for less than a week, barely knew each other, and had no experience raising children. Any territorial agent would likely question their ability to suddenly take on 5 orphaned children. "When is this agent arriving?" Samuel asked. "Within the week," Sheriff Henderson replied. "Her name is Miss Victoria Pemberton, and she has a reputation for being thorough in her evaluations." After the sheriff departed, the ranch house fell into worried silence. Annie retreated to a corner with her siblings, whispering urgently about their options. Clara could see the fear in all their faces, the terror of being separated. "After surviving so much together, we need help," Clara said. "Finally, legal help, character witnesses, anything that will convince this Miss Pemberton that the children belong here." Samuel nodded grimly. "I'll send word to Judge Morrison in Cedar Falls. He presided over our wedding, and he knows our character. And Reverend Mackenzie, his word carries weight with territorial officials." Eleanor Rodriguez, who'd been quietly helping with the children's care, spoke up with surprising firmness. "The whole community will speak for you. Everyone can see how these children have bloomed in just 3 days. That is not accident, that is love." Over the next several days, word of the children's situation spread throughout Cedar Falls and the surrounding ranches. The response surprised even Clara with its warmth and support. Mrs. Patterson arrived with a wagon full of children's clothing, donated by families throughout town. Dr. Carter wrote a detailed medical report documenting the children's improvement under the Morrisons' care. Even the school teacher, Miss Williams, offered to provide educational assessments proving the children were thriving. But it was Annie herself who provided the most compelling evidence of the family's well-being. With proper food and rest, the 13-year-old girl was transforming from a desperate survival mode into something approaching normal adolescence. She laughed at Michael's jokes, helped Lucy with her letters, and had even begun teaching Johnny and Jacob simple arithmetic, using beans from Elena's kitchen. "Annie," Clara said one evening as they worked together preparing supper, "I want you to know that no matter what this territorial agent decides, Samuel and I will fight to keep your family together." Annie paused in her vegetable chopping, her green eyes serious. "Why?" she asked simply. "You don't even know us. We're not your responsibility." Clara considered the question carefully. "When I came to Montana, I thought I was looking for security and a practical arrangement. But sometimes life gives us something we didn't even know we needed. You and your brothers and sisters, you've made this house feel like a real home. But we're not easy, Annie pointed out honestly. Thomas still wakes up crying every night. Jacob has nightmares about Mama dying. Lucy follows you round like a lost puppy. And the boys track mud through the house constantly. Clara smiled at Annie's realistic assessment. Annie, families aren't supposed to be easy. They're supposed to be worth the trouble. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Judge Morrison rode into the ranch yard just as the sun was setting, his formal black coat and hat making his presence seem both official and ominous. Judge Morrison, Samuel said, greeting the older man with obvious concern. We weren't expecting you. I came as soon as I heard about Miss Pemberton's impending visit, the judge replied gravely. Samuel, Clara, I need to speak with you about the legal realities you're facing inside the house. Judge Morrison accepted coffee and studied the children with careful attention. Thomas was sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms, while the other children gathered around the kitchen table working on letters and drawings by lamplight. The scene radiated domestic tranquility and obvious affection. The children seem remarkably well adjusted, Judge Morrison observed. They're incredible children. Clara replied. Annie has kept her family together against impossible odds, and they all look after each other with such devotion. Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. That will work in your favor, but I must be honest about the challenges ahead. Miss Pemberton has a reputation for favoring institutional placements over family situations. She considers irregular. Irregular how? Samuel asked. New marriages, couples without child-rearing experience, situations that don't fit standard family models, the judge explained. She views herself as protecting children from uncertain circumstances. Annie looked up from her writing. What would she consider regular circumstances for us? Judge Morrison met the girl's direct gaze with respect. Ideally, placement with relatives or long-established families with proven child-rearing experience. Failing that, institutional care with structured supervision. Orphanages, Annie said flatly. I'm afraid so. Miss Pemberton believes large families should be divided among multiple placements to reduce the burden on any single household. Clara felt anger rising in her chest. The burden. These children aren't burdens, they're a family. I agree completely, Judge Morrison said quickly. But convincing Miss Pemberton will require more than emotional appeals. We need documented evidence of stability, financial capability, and community support. Samuel leaned forward intently. What kind of evidence? Financial records proving you can support 5 additional family members. Character testimonials from respected community members. Medical reports documenting the children's improved health. Educational assessments showing their intellectual development. Judge Morrison paused, studying Samuel and Clara carefully. And perhaps most importantly, evidence that your marriage is genuine and stable rather than a convenience arrangement. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. Their marriage was indeed a practical arrangement, barely a week old. Between near strangers, any thorough investigation would reveal that uncomfortable truth. Judge Morrison, Clara said carefully, our marriage may have begun as a practical arrangement, but our commitment to these children is completely genuine. I believe you. The judge replied kindly, but Miss Pemberton will likely view a week-old mail-order marriage as evidence of instability rather than commitment. Annie had been listening intently to the adult conversation. Now she spoke up with surprising maturity. What if we wrote letters, all of us, explaining why we want to stay together and why we feel safe here? Would that help? Judge Morrison smiled at the girl's suggestion. Actually, yes. Children's own testimony carries significant weight in these evaluations. If you could articulate your feelings and experiences clearly, it might make a powerful impression. Over the next 2 days, the entire community mobilized to support the Morrison family's case. Reverend Mackenzie wrote a glowing character reference emphasizing Samuel's integrity and Clara's compassionate nature. Dr. Carter provided detailed medical records showing dramatic improvement in all the children's health. The banker, Mr. Patterson, prepared financial statements proving Samuel's ability to support a large family. But it was the children's own letters that proved most compelling. Annie wrote with mature eloquence about her mother's dying wish and the terror of potential separation. Michael described feeling safe for the first time since his father's death. Lucy drew pictures of the whole family together, complete with stick figures labeled Mama Clara and Papa Samuel. Even little Johnny, with his 5-year-old writing skills, managed to scrawl, "I like it here. Please don't make us go away." Clara found herself deeply moved by the children's expressions of belonging and security. In less than a week, these orphan children had begun viewing her and Samuel as parents a responsibility that both thrilled and terrified her. The evening before Miss Pemberton's expected arrival, Clara stood on the front porch watching Samuel teach Michael and the twins how to properly care for horses. Annie was inside helping Elena with Thomas's evening feeding, while Lucy practiced her letters at the kitchen table. The scene was so naturally domestic that it was hard to believe it had existed for less than a week. Nervous, Samuel asked, joining her on the porch after settling the children for the night. Terrified, Clara admitted, "What if we're not enough? What if our marriage being so new counts against us?" Samuel was quiet for several minutes, watching the stars appear over the Montana mountains. "Clara," he said finally, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens tomorrow, these past few days have shown me something I didn't expect." "What's that?" "That marriage isn't just about practical arrangements or even romantic love. It's about building something meaningful together, something larger than either person could create alone." He turned to face her directly. "You've shown courage and love that I didn't know existed. If we lose the children, it won't be because you weren't worthy of them." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "Samuel, I need you to know that whatever Miss Pemberton decides, I want to keep trying. These children, this family, it's worth fighting for." "Then we'll fight," Samuel said simply. Together, as they prepared for bed, both Clara and Samuel knew that tomorrow would determine not only the fate of 5 orphaned children, but the future of their own unlikely marriage. Miss Victoria Pemberton would arrive with the power to transform their newly formed family into either a triumph of love over bureaucracy or a heartbreaking separation that would haunt them all forever. The battle for their family was about to begin. Miss Victoria Pemberton arrived at the Morrison Ranch on a gray November morning in a hired buggy from Cedar Falls, her stern appearance immediately casting a shadow over the household. She was a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a black dress that seemed designed to intimidate. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Mr. Franklin, struggled with an enormous case of forms and documentation. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Miss Pemberton announced without preamble as she stepped down from the buggy, "I am here to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of these children's living situation and determine their proper placement within the territorial care system." Clara felt her stomach clench with anxiety, but she managed to maintain a welcoming expression. "Miss Pemberton, we're grateful you've come to see how well the children are doing. Would you like to come inside and meet them? I prefer to conduct my initial observations without the children being aware of my purpose." Miss Pemberton replied crisply, "It provides more accurate assessment of their natural behavior patterns." Through the kitchen window, the children could be seen playing in the yard under Elena's watchful supervision. Thomas sat propped against a tree, reaching for colorful leaves that Lucy collected for him. Jacob and Johnny were building elaborate structures with sticks and stones, while Michael helped Annie hang laundry on the line. The scene radiated contentment and normal childhood activity. Miss Pemberton observed for several minutes, making notes in a leather-bound journal. "The children appear adequately fed and clothed," she noted aloud, "though I observe concerning signs of premature responsibility in the older girl." Clara bristled at the criticism of Annie's helpfulness, but forced herself to remain silent. Samuel stepped forward diplomatically. "Annie has shown remarkable maturity in caring for her siblings, but she's been encouraged to return to more age-appropriate activities now that she has adult support. Premature responsibility often indicates inadequate adult supervision." Miss Pemberton replied coolly, "Children who are forced to assume parental roles frequently suffer developmental disruption." Mr. Franklin, The assistant seemed embarrassed by his supervisor's harsh tone. He offered Clara a sympathetic glance while setting up his portable desk. For the formal interview process, I'll need to speak with each child individually, Miss Pemberton announced, as well as conducting separate interviews with both spouses regarding their motivations and capabilities. The individual interviews proved to be an ordeal that tested everyone's patience and revealed Miss Pemberton's obvious bias toward institutional care. She questioned Annie aggressively about her experiences caring for the younger children, seeming to view the girl's competence as evidence of exploitation rather than admirable resilience. "You've been cooking meals for 5 people since age 12? Miss Pemberton asked, her tone suggesting impropriety. "I learned because I had to," Annie replied with dignity. "After Papa died, Mama got sick and someone had to help. Children shouldn't have to assume such responsibilities. In a proper institutional setting, you would have been free to focus on education and social development appropriate to your age." Clara, listening from the next room, had to grip her hands together to keep from interrupting. The woman was treating Annie's courage and love as character flaws rather than remarkable strengths. Michael's interview revealed his quiet intelligence and deep attachment to his siblings. When asked about his preferences for living arrangements, he answered with careful thought. "I like learning about ranching from Mr. Samuel," Michael said, "and Mrs. Clara helps me with my reading every evening. But mostly I just want to stay with Annie and the little ones. We're a family." "Families come in many forms," Miss Pemberton replied dismissively. "Often children benefit from placement in more structured environments with trained supervision." Lucy's interview broke Clara's heart completely. The 7-year-old sat primly in the kitchen chair, her small hands folded and her blue eyes serious as she answered Miss Pemberton's questions. "Do you miss your mama and papa?" Miss Pemberton asked. "Every day," Lucy whispered. "But Mrs. Clara hugs me when I'm sad, and she smells like flowers instead of sickness like Mama did at the end. And if you had to go live somewhere else, away from your brothers and sisters, how would that make you feel?" Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "Please don't make me go away. I promise I'll be good. I help with baby Thomas, and I don't cry at night anymore." Clara had to step outside to compose herself, her maternal instincts in full revolt against the trauma this woman was inflicting on already vulnerable children. The twins' interview proved equally distressing. Johnny, still protective of his recovering brother, answered for both of them with fierce determination. "Jacob was really sick, but Dr. Carter made him better, and Mrs. Clara takes care of him." Johnny explained earnestly, "We don't want to live anywhere else. This is our home now." When Miss Pemberton suggested that the twins might be happier in an institutional setting, with other children their age, Jacob spoke up for the first time, his voice still weak from his recent illness. "I don't want other children. I want my family." Even baby Thomas seemed to sense the tension in the house, fussing more than usual and refusing to smile for Miss Pemberton despite his normally sunny disposition. Samuel's interview focused heavily on his financial capabilities and experience with children. Miss Pemberton questioned him thoroughly about the ranch's profitability, his long-term business prospects, and his motivations for taking on 5 additional dependents. "Mr. Morrison," she said with obvious skepticism, "you've been a widower for years, living alone and focused entirely on your business. Suddenly you marry a stranger and within days take on 5 orphan children. This appears to be either remarkably impulsive decision-making or a calculated attempt to provide cheap labor for your operation." Samuel's jaw tightened at the insulting implication, but he maintained his composure. "Miss Pemberton, these children needed help, and my wife and I were in a position to provide it. The decision was based on compassion and moral obligation, not business considerations. And your marriage? How can a week-old arrangement between strangers provide the stability these children require?" "My marriage to Clara may have begun as a practical arrangement," Samuel replied carefully, "but our commitment to each other and to these children is completely genuine. Some relationships are built on shared challenges and common purpose rather than romantic courtship." Clara's interview proved to be the most challenging of all. Miss Pemberton clearly viewed her as an inexperienced young woman who'd taken on responsibilities far beyond her capabilities. Mrs. Morrison, Miss Pemberton began with barely concealed condescension. You've never been married before, never raised children, and you've known these youngsters for less than a week. What qualifies you to serve as guardian to 5 traumatized orphans? Clara took a deep breath, drawing on reserves of confidence she'd discovered over the past week. Miss Pemberton, I may not have formal experience, but I have something equally important: genuine love for these children and absolute commitment to their welfare. Annie kept this family alive for 3 months through courage and determination. The least I can do is provide them with the security and affection they deserve. Love is insufficient without proper training and institutional support. Miss Pemberton replied dismissively. These children require structured rehabilitation from their traumatic experiences, not amateur enthusiasm. What they require, Clara said with growing firmness, is to stay together as their mother wanted, with people who see them as individuals rather than cases to be managed. Miss Pemberton's expression grew even more disapproving. Your emotional attachment may seem admirable, but it clouds professional judgment. I've seen many well-meaning families overwhelmed by the complexities of caring for damaged children. The word damaged sent fury through Clara's veins. These children aren't damaged, Miss Pemberton. They're resilient, loving, and remarkably strong. If you can't see that, perhaps you're in the wrong profession. Mr. Franklin coughed nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between the two women. Miss Pemberton made several pointed notes in her journal before continuing. I'll need to examine the children's living quarters and assess the adequacy of their accommodations, she announced. The tour of the house revealed comfortable, clean spaces where the children had already begun to establish their own routines and territories. Lucy had arranged her few possessions carefully in the room she shared with Annie, while the boys had claimed corners of their shared space with typical childhood enthusiasm. Thomas's crib stood next to Clara and Samuel's bed, allowing for nighttime feedings and monitoring. The sleeping arrangements appear adequate, Miss Pemberton noted grudgingly, though I question the wisdom of placing an infant in the master bedroom of a newly married couple. Thomas still requires feeding every few hours, Clara explained. Patiently, this arrangement ensures he receives immediate attention when needed. In an institutional setting, trained night staff would handle such requirements without disrupting family routines. Clara bit back her response that Thomas wasn't a disruption, but a beloved family member, whose needs came first. The evaluation continued through lunch, where Miss Pemberton observed the family's mealtime dynamics with critical attention. She noted how naturally the children had assumed helpful roles: Annie serving food, Michael ensuring his younger siblings had everything they needed, Lucy entertaining Thomas while Clara ate. The children appear to have adjusted their behavior to please their new guardians, Miss Pemberton observed to her assistant. This compliance may indicate anxiety about their security rather than genuine comfort. Eleanor Rodriguez, who'd been quietly helping with the meal preparation, could no longer contain herself. Segura, she said with respectful firmness, these children are not performing. They are happy. In 3 months living wild, they never laughed. Here, they laugh every day. Miss Pemberton regarded Eleanor with obvious dismissal. Your observations, while well-intentioned, lack professional training in child psychology, but they have training in human kindness, Eleanor replied with dignity. As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that Miss Pemberton had arrived with predetermined conclusions about the inadequacy of the Morrison household. Her questions grew more pointed, her observations more critical, and her recommendations more obvious. But then something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the evaluation. Mr. Franklin, who'd been quietly documenting the proceedings, approached Clara during a brief break in the interviews. His young face showed obvious distress. Mrs. Morrison, he said quietly, glancing around to ensure Miss Pemberton wasn't listening. I need to tell you something about Miss Pemberton's methods. Clara felt a chill of apprehension. What do you mean? She's done this before. Mr. Franklin whispered urgently. Separated families, placed children in institutions even when loving homes were available. She believes institutional care is inherently superior to family placement, regardless of circumstances. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Mr. Franklin's expression grew pained. Because I was one of those children, Mrs. Morrison. Miss Pemberton separated me from my sister 12 years ago. I haven't seen Rebecca since she was sent to an institution in California while I was placed in Minnesota. I've been searching for her ever since. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She deliberately separates siblings. She views it as reducing dependency and encouraging individual development. Mr. Franklin explained bitterly. She'll recommend splitting your children among multiple placements, claiming it's in their best interests. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. This woman was preparing to destroy the very bonds that had kept these children alive and sane through their traumatic experiences. What can we do? Clara asked desperately. Mr. Franklin glanced toward the main room where Miss Pemberton was reviewing her notes, challenge her authority, demand a second evaluation, appeal to Judge Morrison for injunctive relief, do anything to delay her recommendations until you can present your case to higher authorities. As evening approached and Miss Pemberton prepared to return to town for the night, she announced her preliminary conclusions with bureaucratic satisfaction. Based on my initial assessment, she declared, I will be recommending division of these children among several specialized placements better equipped to address their individual needs. Annie, who'd been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with the same courage she'd shown in keeping her family alive. Miss Pemberton, she said clearly, my mother made me promise to keep our family together. I won't let you break that promise, young lady. Miss Pemberton replied coldly, your mother's wishes, while understandable, may not align with professional assessments of your best interests. My mother knew what was best for us, and he shot back with growing anger. She knew we belonged together, not scattered across the country like we don't matter to each other. Clara stepped beside Annie, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. Miss Pemberton, we'll be appealing your preliminary assessment. These children have a right to stay together, and we intend to fight for that right. Miss Pemberton's smile was thin and cold. You may certainly appeal, Mrs. Morrison. However, I should warn you that territorial authorities generally defer to professional assessments in matters of child welfare. As the woman departed in her hired buggy, Clara felt both despair and determination warring in her chest. The battle for their family was about to become a war, and she wasn't sure they had the weapons to win. But one thing had become crystal clear over the past week. These children weren't just refugees. She was helping they were her children now, and she would fight anyone who tried to tear them apart, even if it meant taking on the entire territorial bureaucracy. The morning after Miss Pemberton's departure, Clara found herself pacing the kitchen at dawn while baby Thomas slept peacefully in his high chair, and the other children remained unaware of the threat hanging over their newly formed family. Samuel sat at the table reviewing legal documents Judge Morrison had sent over during the night, his weathered face grim with concentration. Franklin was right, Samuel said quietly, looking up from a stack of official papers. Miss Pemberton has a documented pattern of recommending family separations. Judge Morrison found records of at least 12 cases in the past 3 years, where she split siblings among different institutions. Clara felt sick to her stomach. 12 families destroyed by one woman's prejudices. More than that, Samuel replied, holding up a telegram that had arrived with the morning mail. Judge Morrison contacted colleagues in Helena. Apparently, Miss Pemberton has connections with several private institutions that receive territorial funding for each child placed in their care. There may be financial incentives behind her recommendations. The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. You're saying she profits from separating children. The institutions do, and she receives placement fees for each successful recommendation. Samuel confirmed, it's not technically illegal, but it creates obvious conflicts of interest. Before Clara could respond, Annie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her green eyes bright with intelligence despite the early hour. I heard voices, she said simply. What's wrong? Clara exchanged glances with Samuel, unsure how much to reveal. To the 13-year-old who'd already carried too much responsibility for her family's welfare. Annie, Clara said gently, we need to discuss Miss Pemberton's recommendations. She's going to suggest that your family would be better served in different placements. Annie's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "You mean she wants to split us up?" "We won't let that happen," Samuel said firmly. "But we need to build a stronger legal case than we currently have." Annie was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through options and strategies with the same maturity that had kept her siblings alive for 3 months in the wilderness. When she spoke again, her voice carried surprising determination. "What if we could prove Miss Pemberton is wrong about us? What if we could show that we're not damaged or traumatized children who need institutional rehabilitation?" Clara studied the girl's face, recognizing something of her own desperate resourcefulness from years of surviving on minimal means. "What do you have in mind, Annie?" "Mr. Franklin," Annie said simply. "He was separated from his sister. If we could help him find her, prove that the separation hurt them instead of helped, maybe that would show how wrong Miss Pemberton's methods are." Samuel looked up from his papers with sudden interest. "That's actually brilliant, Annie. If we could document the long-term damage caused by Miss Pemberton's previous separations, it would undermine her professional credibility." Clara felt a spark of hope for the first time since the evaluation began. "But how would we find Franklin's sister? It's been 12 years, and she could be anywhere." "Mrs. Patterson," Annie suggested. "She knows everyone who's ever passed through Cedar Falls, and she corresponds with people all over the territory. If anyone could help track down a lost person, it would be her." Within hours, Clara found herself in Mrs. Patterson's cozy parlor, explaining the desperate situation to the boarding house proprietor while Annie sat beside her. With quiet intensity, Mrs. Patterson listened with growing outrage as the full scope of Miss Pemberton's methods became clear. "That woman separated children for money," Mrs. Patterson demanded, her maternal instincts in full revolt. "Why, that's nothing short of trafficking in human misery. We need to find Mr. Franklin's sister Rebecca," Clara explained. "If we can prove that the separation damaged both children unnecessarily, it might help our case." Double quotes Mrs. Patterson immediately began pulling out correspondence files she'd maintained for years. "Rebecca Franklin, placed in California 12 years ago. I remember reading about such cases in the territorial papers. Always seemed wrong to me, breaking up families that were already broken by tragedy." The search consumed the entire morning, with Mrs. Patterson writing urgent letters to contacts throughout the West, while Clara and Annie helped organize information and coordinate communications. Eleanor Rodriguez arrived with lunch and the news that Samuel was consulting with Reverend Mackenzie about rallying community support for a formal challenge to Miss Pemberton's authority. "The whole county is talking about this," Eleanor reported as she unpacked food. "People are angry. Nobody likes the idea of bureaucrats from Helena coming here to destroy families." By afternoon, an extraordinary thing began happening. Word of the Morrison family's fight had spread throughout Cedar Falls and the surrounding ranches, and people began arriving to offer support and assistance. Dr. Carter brought medical documentation proving the dramatic improvement in all 5 children's health and development. The school teacher, Miss Williams, arrived with educational assessments showing remarkable intellectual progress. In just 1 week of stable home environment, most significantly, other families began coming forward with their own stories of Miss Pemberton's destructive interventions. Tom Bradley, one of Samuel's ranch hands, revealed that his own cousin had been separated from siblings by Miss Pemberton 3 years earlier. She told the family that the children would receive better individual attention in separate placements. Tom explained to the growing group assembled in the Morrison parlor, but little Mary cried herself sick for months, asking for her brothers. The family tried to get them back together, but the bureaucracy made it nearly impossible. As evening approached, what had begun as a desperate search for one family's evidence had evolved into something approaching a community uprising against institutional abuse of vulnerable children. The breakthrough came just after sunset, when Mrs. Patterson received a response to one of her urgent telegrams. She burst into the Morrison house with obvious excitement, waving a yellow telegram form. "Found her," Mrs. Patterson announced triumphantly. "Rebecca Franklin, now Rebecca Chen. Married to a Chinese immigrant in San Francisco, my friend Martha Collins runs a mission there," and remembered the story. Rebecca was placed in St. Catherine's Home for Girls, but she ran away at 16 and has been supporting herself ever since. Clara felt her heart racing with excitement and hope. Is she willing to help us? More than willing, Mrs. Patterson replied. According to Martha's telegram, Rebecca has been searching for her brother for years. She'll testify about the damage the separation caused both of them. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face showing the first genuine smile Clara had seen since Miss Pemberton's arrival. Judge Morrison just sent word, based on the evidence we've gathered. He's agreed to request a formal hearing before a territorial review board. Miss Pemberton's preliminary recommendations will be suspended pending the investigation, and he sagged. With relief, the tension she'd been carrying finally releasing. So we don't have to be separated immediately. Not immediately, Samuel confirmed. But we'll need to present a compelling case at the hearing. This is just the beginning of the fight. Over the next 2 days, the Morrison Ranch became the unofficial headquarters for what Elena had begun calling the Children's Crusade. Community members arrived throughout each day, bringing food, offering assistance, and sharing information about Miss Pemberton's previous cases. Most importantly, Mr. Franklin appeared at the ranch on the second evening, having received word about his sister through official channels. The young man's composure finally cracked when Clara showed him the telegram confirming Rebecca's location and willingness to reunite. 12 years, Franklin whispered, tears streaming down his face. 12 years I've been searching for her, and Miss Pemberton told me it was better that we learn to live independently. What was it really like? Annie asked gently. Being separated from your sister. Franklin's expression grew pained as he shared memories he'd clearly tried to suppress. Terrifying. Rebecca was only 8 when they took her away, and I was 10. She cried for days, asking when she could come home. I promised her I'd find her, but the institution moved me to Minnesota, and by the time I was old enough to search seriously, the California records had been lost or destroyed. And Miss Pemberton told you this was beneficial? Clara asked, her anger growing. She said it would help us develop individual identities rather than remaining overly dependent on each other, Franklin replied bitterly. She claimed that siblings who experienced trauma together often reinforced each other's psychological damage. Annie spoke up with the wisdom of someone who'd actually lived through trauma. With siblings, that's exactly wrong. My brothers and sisters are what kept me sane when everything else fell apart. Without them, I would have given up completely. Franklin nodded emphatically. Rebecca and I protected each other. We made each other stronger, not weaker, when they separated us. They took away the only security we had left in the world. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Sheriff Henderson, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger who introduced himself as Territorial Attorney General David Thornton. Clara felt her stomach clench with anxiety, wondering if this represented new official pressure to accept Miss Pemberton's recommendations. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, Attorney General Thornton began formally. I've come to discuss some serious allegations that have been brought to my attention. Regarding Miss Pemberton's evaluation methods, Samuel stepped forward protectively. What kind of allegations? Corruption, conflict of interest, and systematic abuse of vulnerable children. Thornton replied with surprising firmness. Your case has prompted other families to come forward with similar complaints. We're opening a formal investigation into Miss Pemberton's practices and financial relationships with private institutions. Clara felt hope surge through her chest. What does this mean for our children? It means Miss Pemberton's authority in this case is suspended immediately, Thornton announced. A new evaluation will be conducted by an independent assessor, with no financial ties to institutional placements. Annie stepped forward with characteristic directness. Sir, what about Mr. Franklin's sister? Will you help them reunite? Attorney General Thornton smiled at the girl's boldness. Young lady, that investigation is already underway. If Miss Pemberton unlawfully separated siblings for financial gain, the territory will take action to remedy those injustices. As the officials departed with promises of swift action, the ranch house erupted in celebration. Elena immediately began planning a feast to mark their victory, while the children danced around the kitchen with infectious joy. But Clara noticed that Annie remained quiet amid the celebration. standing near the window and staring out at the November landscape with thoughtful concentration. What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Clara asked, joining the girl at the window. "About all the other children," Annie replied softly. "The ones Miss Pemberton separated before we could stop her. What happens to them?" Clara felt a surge of pride at Annie's compassion for others, even in the midst of her own family's triumph. "I think," she said slowly, "that you've started something that's going to help a lot of families. Not just our own." Annie nodded seriously. "Good. Mama always said that surviving bad things was only worthwhile if you used the experience to help other people avoid the same suffering." Looking at this remarkable 13-year-old who'd kept her family alive through impossible circumstances and was now concerned about strangers facing similar trauma, Clara realized that she and Samuel hadn't just gained 5 children, they'd gained a daughter whose courage and wisdom would continue inspiring them for years to come. The immediate crisis was over, but Clara suspected that their family's real adventure was just beginning. With Annie's leadership and the community's support, they were positioned to become advocates for vulnerable children throughout the territory. They'd fought for the right to stay together as a family. Now they had the opportunity to help other families do the same. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the Morrison ranch as Clara hung laundry on the line behind the house, watching her family, for they were truly her family, now scattered across the yard in various spring activities. Thomas, now a healthy 15-month-old with rosy cheeks and boundless energy, toddled between his siblings with the confidence of a child who'd never known want or fear. The transformation from the skeletal infant they'd rescued was nothing short of miraculous. Annie, now 14 and blooming into young womanhood, sat beneath the apple tree that was bursting with pink and white blossoms, helping Lucy with her arithmetic while keeping one eye on the twins as they attempted to build an elaborate fort from leftover lumber. The girl who'd once carried the weight of her family's survival on her thin shoulders now moved with the easy grace of someone who trusted that adult protection was reliable and permanent. "Mama Clara," Lucy called out, using the name that still made Clara's heart flutter with joy 6 months later. "Annie says if I can do all these sums correctly, I can help with the new baby horses." Clara smiled at the 8-year-old's enthusiasm. The ranch had welcomed 3 foals this spring, and the children had been fascinated by the process of caring for newborn animals. "If Annie says you're ready, then I trust her judgment completely." Michael emerged from the barn leading one of the gentle mares, his 13-year-old frame filling out with proper nutrition and the physical work of ranch life. He'd discovered a natural aptitude for animal husbandry that delighted Samuel, who'd begun teaching the boy the finer points of cattle breeding and horse training. "Mrs. Morrison," Michael called formally. He still struggled with calling her mama, though his affection was obvious in his actions. "Mr. Samuel wants to know if you can come look at the new correspondence from Helena. He says it's important." News about the hearing results. Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Although Miss Pemberton had been suspended from her position pending investigation, the formal hearings about her misconduct and the fate of previously separated families had been proceeding slowly through territorial bureaucracy. The Morrison family's custody had been confirmed months ago, but the broader questions of justice for other families remained unresolved. Inside the house, Clara found Samuel in his study, surrounded by official documents and letters that represented months of legal proceedings. His expression was a mixture of satisfaction and amazement as he looked up from a formal letter bearing the territorial seal. "It's over," Samuel announced simply. "Miss Pemberton has been formally dismissed from territorial service and barred from any future involvement in child welfare decisions. More importantly, the review board has ordered reunification efforts for all families she separated over the past 5 years." Clara sank into the chair beside his desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this meant. All of them, even families separated years ago, every case they can document, Samuel confirmed, holding up a stack of papers. "The territorial government is establishing a fund to assist with reunification efforts, and they're implementing new regulations requiring that siblings be kept together unless absolutely impossible. And Mr. Franklin and Rebecca," Samuel's smile broadened, They reunited last month in San Francisco. Rebecca is expecting her first child, and Franklin has been offered a position with the Territorial Attorney General's office, specifically working on child welfare reform. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A small cavalcade was making its way up the ranch road. Judge Morrison, Attorney General Thornton, and several other officials Clara didn't recognize. "Looks like we're receiving official visitors," Samuel observed, rising to greet their guests. The delegation brought news that surpassed even their most optimistic hopes. Attorney General Thornton, looking far more relaxed than during his previous official visit, carried a leather portfolio filled with documents and what appeared to be several legal certificates. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Thornton began formally, though his tone was warm with approval. "I've come to finalize some official business that has been pending for several months." Clara felt a moment of old anxiety, the reflexive fear that bureaucrats brought bad news rather than good. "First," Thornton continued, "the territorial legislature has voted to establish the Morrison Family Protection Act, requiring that any future child welfare decisions prioritize family preservation and sibling unity, unless compelling evidence suggests otherwise." Annie, who'd been listening from the kitchen with her siblings, stepped forward with the directness that had become her trademark. "Does that mean other families won't be separated like we almost were?" "That's exactly what it means, Miss Annie," Judge Morrison replied with obvious pride. "Your courage in fighting for your family has helped protect other families throughout the territory." Thornton opened his portfolio and withdrew several official documents. "Second, the territorial government is offering formal commendations to several individuals whose efforts exposed Miss Pemberton's corruption and protected vulnerable children." He handed certificates to Samuel and Clara, but the largest and most ornate document was presented to Annie herself. "Miss Annie Patterson, I understand you've chosen to take the Morrison family name. Legally, this commendation recognizes your extraordinary courage in keeping your family together and your instrumental role in exposing systematic abuse of the territorial child welfare system." Annie accepted the certificate with tears in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Thank you, sir, but I didn't do anything special. I just kept the promise I made to my mama." "Sometimes," Attorney General Thornton replied gently, "keeping promises requires more courage than most adults possess." But the most significant surprise came when Judge Morrison stepped forward with his own legal documents. "Samuel, Clara, the territorial legislature has also voted to grant you official recognition as the Morrison Family Home for Children, a licensed facility for emergency placement of orphaned or abandoned children who need temporary care, while permanent family arrangements are made." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. You mean we can help other children like us?" Annie asked, her green eyes bright with excitement. "If you're willing to take on such responsibility," Judge Morrison confirmed, "the territory would provide funding for expansion of your facilities and support for additional children as needed. It would be volunteer work, but it would also give you official authority to intervene in cases where children need protection." Samuel looked at Clara questioningly, though she suspected he already knew her answer. Over the past 6 months, their home had naturally become a gathering place for children from throughout the county who needed temporary care, extra meals, or simply a safe place to play. What the officials were proposing would formalize something that was already happening organically. "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with Eleanor Rodriguez organizing a feast that seemed to materialize from thin air, and half the county arriving to offer congratulations and support. Mrs. Patterson presented Clara with a hand-stitched quilt featuring squares contributed by every family in Cedar Falls, each depicting some aspect of their remarkable journey, from mail-order marriage to territorial heroes. But the most meaningful moment came as the evening wound down and the children prepared for bed. Annie approached Clara and Samuel with unusual formality. Her siblings gathered behind her in obvious support of whatever she planned to say. "Mama Clara, Papa Samuel," Annie began, using the parental titles that had evolved naturally over the months. "We've been talking, and we want you to know something important." Clara felt a flutter of anxiety. Had the children been discussing their future? Were they having second thoughts about their placement? When Mama was dying, Annie continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. She made me promise to keep our family together. I thought that meant just the 5 of us, just her blood children. She paused, looking around at her siblings, who nodded encouragingly. But now I understand that she meant something bigger than that. She meant we should find people who would love us and let us love them back. She meant we should build the kind of family that makes everyone stronger and happier. Lucy stepped forward and took Clara's hand. "What Annie means is that we want to adopt you and Papa Samuel, just like you adopted us." The innocence and love in the 8-year-old's declaration broke Clara's composure completely. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt to embrace Lucy, then found herself surrounded by all 5 children in a group hug that seemed to encompass everything beautiful and meaningful about their unlikely journey. "I think," Samuel said, his own voice thick with emotion, "that's the finest adoption proposal any parents could receive." Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the last visitors had departed, Clara and Samuel found themselves on the front porch where they'd shared so many conversations over the past months. The spring air was warm with the promise of summer, and the mountains stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky that seemed infinite with possibility. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked quietly, "answering my advertisement, coming to Montana, taking on responsibilities you never could have imagined?" Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about the frightened woman who'd stepped off the train in Cedar Falls less than a year ago. That woman had been seeking security and a practical arrangement that would keep her from destitution. She'd found something far more valuable and infinitely more complex. "Never," she replied with absolute certainty. "I came here thinking I was looking for safety, but I found purpose instead. I thought I was settling for a marriage of convenience, but I discovered what real love actually means." Samuel took her hand, their wedding rings catching the starlight. "What does real love mean?" "It means choosing to build something beautiful together, even when it's difficult. It means taking responsibility for each other's happiness and welfare. It means creating a family that's bigger than the sum of its individual parts." Samuel smiled at her answer. "Martha would have liked you very much. She always said that the best families weren't born, they were chosen. And we chose well," Clara observed, thinking of the sleeping children who'd transformed their practical arrangement into something approaching magic inside the house. Baby Thomas murmured softly in his sleep, while Annie's voice drifted down from upstairs as she told the twins a bedtime story about brave children who found their way home through courage and love. As spring gave way to summer, and their family continued to grow not just through the children who came to them for temporary care, but through the network of relationships they'd built throughout the territory, Clara often marveled at the unpredictable paths that led to happiness. She'd answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride because she had no other options. She'd found 5 orphan children because she couldn't bear to see them separated. She'd fought territorial bureaucracy because love demanded nothing less than fierce protection of those who needed it most. What she'd discovered in the process was that sometimes the most extraordinary lives began with the most ordinary decisions to be kind, when kindness wasn't required, to fight when fighting seemed hopeless, and to love when love seemed risky. The girl who'd been to Plain and too poor to find a husband in Boston had become the woman who'd helped reform territorial child welfare policy. The mail-order bride who'd expected a practical arrangement had found a love story that would inspire other families for generations to come. And 5 orphan children who'd faced winter in the wilderness with nothing but each other's courage had found the guardian angel they'd prayed for, a woman who'd proven that sometimes angels come in the most unexpected packages, wearing simple dresses and carrying battered satchels full of hope. As the Montana stars wheeled overhead and the ranch settled into peaceful sleep, Clara Morrison knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead. There would be more children who needed protection, more families who needed reunification, more battles against systems that forgot the humanity of the people they were supposed to serve. But there would also be birthdays and Christmas mornings, school graduations and wedding celebrations, grandchildren who would grow up hearing stories about the brave mail-order bride who'd found 5 orphans and discovered that love was indeed the most powerful force in the world. The future stretched before them like the vast Montana landscape, full of challenges and opportunities, hardships and joys, but most importantly, full of love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings into something strong enough to change the world, one child at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.